Hello everyone, I'm JG. Welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be talking about the new Gorillaz album, Humanz. Now I've been anxiously waiting this new Gorillaz albums, because if you haven't noticed, I'm a really big fan of the Gorillaz. I also owe a lot of my current music taste to Gorillaz, because back when I discovered this group a few years ago, the only music that I listened to really was rock music. And of course when I stumbled upon Gorillaz, they have elements of rock music in their music, however they also have elements of hip-hop and electronic music. And when I was kind of exposed to these genres that I used to hate, even though I really didn't have much of a reason to, other than, that's just kind of what I had always been, told to do really. When I began to be exposed to these genres, kind of mixed in with the rock music that Gorillaz had, it really kind of got me exposed to these genres and got me to fall in love with these genres in their own right. Of course, I began to discover a lot of hip-hop music following the time I spent, listening to a lot of Gorillaz music, and later on I would go on to listen to a lot more electronic music. So I owed a lot of my music taste to Gorillaz, honestly. They're one of the most influential bands in my life, pretty much. Moving on to the actual album itself, I would say as a whole, Humanz leans a lot more for the electronic and hip-hop influenced sound than it does a rock-leaning sound, and Gorillaz have always experimented with these genres, but here they lean a lot more towards the electronic and hip-hop elements than they do the rock elements. There's not a lot of rock music on this album, so if you're a Gorillaz fan that only really likes the rock stuff that they do and kind of ignore the hip-hop and electronic stuff, maybe this album isn't quite for you. But if you're someone that likes everything Gorillaz does, this is something that, you should be paying attention to. A lot of the more electronic-leaning beats that you hear here sound a lot better than any kind of electronic stuff that you would hear, in the mainstream today. It definitely has a more underground sort of indie alternative sound to it, which I do very much enjoy. It reminds me a lot of their album Plastic Beach, which, I keep wanting to say it's their previous album, though technically The Fall was the last album they released, both those albums in 2010. And, Plastic Beach was kind of the last, I guess you could say big album for Gorillaz. The Fall was kind of, just recorded quickly after that and kind of put out. I almost don't consider it like a full album, even though it is. Though, I'm going to constantly want to refer to Plastic Beach as their last album throughout this review. Sorry for that. Speaking of Plastic Beach, another thing that reminds me of that album here on this project is the amount of guest features, in that there is a lot of them. The standard track listing on this album, which is the one I'm reviewing now, I'm not talking about the deluxe tracks at all. There's only one track, if you exclude the kind of interlude tracks that pop up a lot here, that is just Gorillaz only with no features at all, which, is a very small amount. Now, I feel somewhat mixed on this aspect of the album, and Plastic Beach also to an extent. It's something I know many other people feel about as well, because, going back to Gorillaz' first album, the guest features, while they were there, they weren't super prominent, super overbearing, and, it kind of grew to the point where we are now that, the guest features seem to be dominating almost. There's some tracks here that don't even feel like Gorillaz tracks in the sense that, it's just the guest features are the only ones doing vocals, and the beats sound more electronic, so it just sounds like their own tracks sometimes. It doesn't even sound like Gorillaz, kind of unlike some of the tracks from their earlier efforts, like Demon Days, where it was still clearly Gorillaz because you had, those Gorilla elements, whether it be the instrumentals or, 2D's vocals. On the other hand, while the guest features may be very overbearing here on this project, it's important to mention that they are very good guest features. A lot of these artists here do a very good job, and, the ones I was familiar with going into this project, there was only 3 of them, which were Danny Brown, Pusha T, and De La Soul. I like all those artists a lot, so, I have really high hopes going into this, and I know just because it's Gorillaz, they tend to be very, I guess you could say selective, have very high standards when it comes to their guest features. They just won't throw anyone on to their album, pretty much. And so, even for the artists I wasn't familiar with here on this album, I was kind of expecting high things from them, and that's really what I got for the most part. There was a few average performances, but that's really it. Now, when talking about Gorillaz, I think one of the most important things to bring up is the virtual band aspect of this group, because, while there is the actual people that are behind the music in the real world, which is Damon Albarn and company, the guest features and stuff like that, there's also the virtual band that, is kind of a very interesting aspect of this band, to say the least. You have 2D, Noodle, Murdoch, and Russell. And I really like these characters. I'm into animation, all that kind of stuff. So having an animated band, it seems like something that would be kind of a gimmicky thing to do. But, Gorillaz do a very good job of making it interesting. All 4 of these band members are very interesting characters. They have interesting backstories. And the stories that they've kind of gone on throughout this band's career are very interesting. And, you know, I like when I listen to Gorillaz, I like to kind of, you know, pretend that I'm listening to these four band members do, you know, like it's actually them. It's not some people kind of pulling the strings on this whole Gorillaz project that's, you know, this virtual band. I like to pretend it's the actual four imaginary characters. I doubt I'm the only one out there that likes to do it. It just makes it kind of cool, in my opinion. Unfortunately, this whole aspect of kind of distancing yourself from what's actually going on and, you know, entering this sort of fantasy world that, you know, the band's fictional universe is kind of in, doesn't really work all too well for this project here, because while I always found myself very invested in the world of Gorillaz' previous efforts, that was mostly because it was very believable. Here on Humanz, it doesn't seem super believable because I have a hard time kind of believing that this is a band effort. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned earlier that it's more electronic, you know, hip-hop leaning. And here, you know, given that they're a rock band pretty much, and just basically saying, you know, they have a guitarist, they have a drummer, they have a bassist, they have keyboards, you know, basic rock band setup, it sounds a lot more like it's, you know, a one-man kind of, you know, producing the beats and stuff like that, which really, in reality, that's what it is. Damon Albarn is doing all the instrumentation here. So from that perspective of being in the real world, looking at it that way, the instrumentals, nothing really seems out of place here. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of the virtual band, as if the virtual band were a real band that made this album, it feels very weird. It feels like some of the band members are definitely not having a full part on this album. 2D, the fake vocalist and, you know, keyboardist for this band, of course, you know, the synths and keyboards and stuff have a prominent role on this album, so that part, of course, makes sense. But his vocal presence on this album is just lacking compared to previous Gorillaz efforts, which is something I've noticed over time. You know, back on the first Gorillaz album, he's very prominent, and over time, as there's more guest features that come on, obviously he has less time to be on the vocals himself. But here, especially on this project, I feel like it's his smallest amount of vocal time. There's only, as I said before, one track that doesn't feature any guests here where he kind of gets the spotlight to himself. And on most of these other tracks, he kind of feels like the guest feature vocalist on his own song, which is kind of awkward to think about. And then going on further from that, of course, Murdoch, you know, the bassist for this band, a lot of the bass here sounds more synthesized, like it could be done with a keyboard, so his presence doesn't feel, you know, as strong. Russell on the drums, of course, there are drums here, but they sound a lot more kind of, you know, electronic, like they're made almost with a drum machine. I mean, it's believable that he could have done the drums here if he was a real person, but I could also very much believe it that this was just done by one person in, like, by themselves. And then, of course, the guitars. Where's Noodle at? Her guitar presence seems completely absent from this project. There's barely any moments on this entire album where we really hear guitars, and it just feels like she's not even part of the band. And I know technically she's not, because she's not a real character, but, you know, if you're kind of just pretending that this is a real band, it just kind of feels like she had no part in this project at all, which she does, given that she's on the album cover and she's in the music video still, so she's still part of the band, but, I mean, you couldn't tell that by listening to it. And I want to compare this album again to Plastic Beach for a moment, because that album was a bit different, given that in the story of Gorillaz, you know, they had lost Noodle and they had lost Russell from the band, so it was just Murdoch and Tootie. And so, of course, they kind of went for a more electronic sound because, of course, they didn't have the guitars really. I mean, they made a cyborg version of Noodle to do guitars, but even still, you know, they didn't have guitars be that prominent on that album. And then for the drums, they had, you know, a drum machine going on, though I believe in the actual recordings it was an actual drummer that was doing the drum parts. I'm not 100% sure on that, though, but I guess he was just imitating a drum machine. But, you know, the kind of electronic-heavy, sort of synthesized sound of that album made sense in the context of, you know, the band being kind of down a few members, left with only like a vocalist, bassist, and a keyboard player. It really kind of made sense from that perspective, and also the perspective of the album being, you know, Plastic Beach, kind of dealing with plastic and fakeness, stuff like that, kind of going for a synth keyboard kind of sound, made a bit of sense in that regard. But I don't really want to go into too much detail about Plastic Beach here, because we're talking about Humanz here. And I just really wanted to make that comparison, because here all the band members are back together now, all four of them, and I really kind of expected more of a band effort, if that makes any sense, but you really don't get that. Now, it may seem like I have a lot of complaints about the album, but that's not really the case, because what I've really been talking about, while it is something that kind of bothers me a good amount, it's really only just one issue, and as I said before, earlier in this review, despite the fact that, you know, they go for this more electronic, hip-hop, not really rock-leaning sound, the thing is, the tracks here, they work well for the most part. They sound good, so even if it doesn't really sound like it's the virtual band making the tracks, it sounds more like it's one person with guest features kind of making the tracks kind of like what it actually is. Even though it sounds like that, it still sounds good, which is kind of, an important part when it comes to music. If it sounds good, I like it. The opening track, Ascension, that features Vince Staples, is a very enjoyable kind of upbeat sounding hip-hop song. Of course, Vince Staples, a rapper, I've heard of him. I haven't heard any of his music though. This is kind of my introduction to him. And it's a very good introduction. He sounds very upbeat and lively here, very catchy hook that he provides. And of course the lyrics here are some of the more political leaning social commentary like lyrics here on the project, but they do a very good job of getting the point across with this very upbeat kind of catchy track. Another highlight in my opinion is the track Saturn's Bars, which features Popcan, who I've never heard of before either. And this is a song on the surface, it sounds like it's typically, if you were to describe the song to me, it's something that I would just hate right off the bat. But listening to it, I can't help but love this track. It's just really catchy in my opinion. I like Popcan's vocals, and I like how later on in the song, his vocals and 2D's vocals start, mixing together. I think that's a really cool part. And I like that the beat kind of sounds mysterious, kind of dark at times. Really cool track in my opinion. The track that immediately follows it, Moments, which features De La Soul, who now this is their third appearance on the Gorillaz album. Of course, they've appeared on some of their biggest hits before. It just makes sense for them to kind of come back. And this track is another one of the more fun songs on the album. I really like how it's just kind of this, driving beat to the track. And they just sound like they're having a blast on this song. And I can't help feel like I'm also having a blast while listening to it. The track Submission is definitely one of the weirdest in the entire track listing, in my opinion. It features two artists on it, the first of which is Kelela. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not familiar with this artist at all. But, I do like the female vocals that are brought to the first half of this track. They sound very nice. The weird part of this track comes with the second half, which features Danny Brown, who I love, of course. I've mentioned him before on my channel. I'm a big fan of his. And, he does a good job here. The only weird part is just kind of the placement of these two kind of together. It's just a bit odd. And, of course, this track also doesn't feature any vocals from 2D. It's one of those tracks that doesn't really feel much like a Gorillaz track. I mean, it's a good track. It just doesn't feel super Gorillaz-y. Another track that really confused me upon listening to it was the track Andromeda, which features Dram, who is a rapper. I know I've heard of him before. I haven't heard any of his music before, but that's not the confusing part. The confusing part is when I listened to the song, I got to the end of the track and I didn't even notice he was there. Of course, given that he's a rapper, I expected him to have like a verse or something like that, but he has really a very small part in this song. It's almost not even noticeable. Like the first time I listened to it, it almost feels like, why bother having him on the track? Now I heard somewhere that he originally did have a verse and also a chorus, but it was cut out for reasons. Maybe it had to do with that whole, they cut out all the Donald Trump references and maybe that's why. Or maybe they just did it for some other reason. I don't know why, but this track has a lot more 2D on it. So if you're a fan of 2D's vocals, this track is definitely more for you. I also like the beat on this track, very interesting. But if you were looking for some Dram, I mean, you're not going to really get him in too much here. I mean, I really didn't know what he does to begin with, so I still don't know what kind of music he does, really. I was kind of hoping I'd find out who Dram was. I didn't. Now, the track Busted in Blue is the one I was talking about. That is the one that doesn't feature any other artists on it, and it's a more typical kind of Gorillaz, very slow, very somber, kind of depressing song, the ones I'm talking about. And, it's not a super interesting track, but it works for what it's trying to do, in my opinion, and I like that they're kind of able to do it without any other features. Now, really concerning the structure of this album, I feel like the beginning of the album is the strongest part, the middle of the album is slightly weaker but still pretty good, and then towards the end of the album it just starts to fall off a bit more. And the track that really kind of starts this off is the track Sex Murder Party, which just feels like this really aimless track. The only part of it that really kind of stands out at all is 2D's verse that he has, but even then it's not super memorable or anything like that. The track just kind of feels aimless all over the place, and for the life of me I can't remember anything really much about it. It's just, I don't really know much why it's there. And then later on we get the track Hallelujah Money, which was the first song from this project I heard. Of course, Gorillaz kind of released it, not as a single, but like they released a video for it, the first kind of thing from this album, music-wise. And when I heard it, like many people, I was a bit concerned because it just had some aspects to it that I wasn't a big fan of. It didn't really feature 2D's vocals a lot. It was mostly, the guest vocals, and it wasn't super, interesting in my opinion when I first heard it. Benjamin Clementine does a good job with his guest vocals here, I gotta say that at least. He does a nice job, and 2D's vocals also sound nice, but the thing is, the beat in the background is just so, like, kind of bare bones and basic and just kind of drones on, and, you know, given that and Clementine's delivery, it just starts to kind of blur together and kind of becomes this monotonous just repetition over and over again. It's not very interesting, and it is still, while it does make more sense to me in the context of the album as a whole, it's definitely not a single track. I'm not sure at all why they released this as kind of the first taste of the album, but, you know, given in the context of the album as a whole, it makes a bit more sense. Still don't really know why it's there, because it's not a very good track in my opinion. It's just kind of drones on, as I said before. The political lyrics here are more, you know, on the nose, very obvious. Maybe that's why they wanted to include it. And I really don't have a problem with the lyrics. It's just the track is a bore to get through most of the time. And then the track that closes this out, We Got the Power, is just kind of a corny song in my opinion. You know, we got the power. It's just really corny, and, you know, given how dark a lot of this album was leading up to it, it just that doesn't really fit in my opinion as a good closer. While Human starts off with some of the best Gorillaz songs I've heard in a long time, the closer for this album is just really a bore to get through. The only track that really kind of stands out is She's My Caller, which is a good song in my opinion. It's just, you know, everything else that kind of surrounds it in the last third of this album, I really just don't care for at all. Now, I also want to talk about the interludes that are present throughout this project. They appear every so often, and they're not very long. However, you know, while they don't exactly hurt the album going through, they don't exactly add much to it. The only one that I really think adds anything to it is the one that comes before Submission, because it kind of fades into the next track nicely, in my opinion. That's the only one that really is very good. But the rest of the ones, I can really care less if they're there or not. I mean, literally one of them is just someone saying, elevator going up. That's it. The whole setup of the album in terms of the placement of the tracks also doesn't seem to have much of a, you know, structure to it. It just kind of feels like a collection of tracks that are put together. These interludes, of course, break them up a bit more, but, you know, it really doesn't have a super cohesive flow to it like some of Gorillaz' previous projects, but it doesn't exactly have a bad flow to it either. It makes sense, but it doesn't exactly, it's not something that's super standout in my opinion. Despite all the complaints I've had with this album, I have to admit, I have a lot of fun listening to this thing. Even the last third that just kind of drags a bit at times, it's still a good time in my opinion listening to it. It's some of the most fun I've had listening to Gorillaz material in a long while. Especially in tracks like Saturn's Bars and Moments, those are just a blast to listen to in my opinion. Definitely some of my new Gorillaz favorites that, you know, I'm going to have a good time listening to. And for the next 7 years, until we get another Gorillaz album, if we ever do. I hope we do. In my opinion, the album's greatest weaknesses are, you know, the fact that the guest features overtake the album at times, the fact that 2D's vocals aren't as present, and if you're looking at it through the perspective of the virtual band, this is the one making the music, they don't even seem to have much of a presence on their own album. However, if you're just looking at the perspective of it being music, just music made by someone out there, it's good music. It's something that, you know, if you're a fan of music of any type, you're bound to find something here on this album that you at least like a little bit, just given how diverse everything here on this project is, from the reggae influence on Saturn's Bars to the more hip-hop tracks like Ascension or Moments to, of course, more, I guess you could say, electronic-leaning stuff. Overall, if you're a fan of Gorillaz, I think you definitely need to check Humanz out because, as I said before, you're going to find something here that you definitely enjoy. If you're a fan of Gorillaz, mostly the rock stuff, as I said before, maybe this isn't quite for you. If you're a fan of rock music only, maybe this isn't quite for you. But if you're a fan of hip-hop, if you're a fan of electronic music, pop music, just music in general, you're going to find something on Humanz that's worth your time. So definitely check this out. And I think that just about sums up my review pretty well, in my opinion. So thank you for watching. If you have anything you'd like to add, anything you'd like to correct, if you know who Dram is, leave it down there in the comment section below. I'd greatly appreciate knowing. Yeah, I would greatly appreciate if you would subscribe, like the video. Thanks for watching. Stay golden. Now I'm off to watch that Saturn's Bars music video again. In the bath.